Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the pre-event session of Global Town Hall 2022. My name is Afni, and I will be the master of ceremony for today's event. Ladies and gentlemen, this public forum is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia in collaboration with Rising Asia Foundation. Today's panel will have a fruitful discussion on who does the 21st century belong to, featuring three distinguished speakers: Mr. Atma Sutadase, President and CEO of the Trade and Development Bank; Ambassador Gurjit Singh, author and former ambassador to Germany, Indonesia, and ASEAN; and last but not least, Ambassador Stefan Gompertz, former ambassador to Austria and Ethiopia. Welcome, gentlemen. Before we start, I would like to also welcome all participants who are joining us on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to ask your questions to the panelists through the live chat on YouTube. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Dayu Nirma Amurwanti, Faculty Member of International Relations Department at BUNUS University. Ms. Dayu, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Afni. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. Again, let me echo what Afni says. Welcome to this pre-event session for the Global Town Hall 2022. If you have not already, please register. The Global Town Hall is going to be held on the 5th of November 2022. Before we begin, allow me to thank the Foreign Policy Community Indonesia, PCI, for inviting me to this event, as well as the Rising Asia Foundation, who is also co-organizing and supporting this event. And allow me to welcome our esteemed panelists, His Excellencies Ambassador Gurjit Singh, author and former ambassador to Germany, Indonesia, and ASEAN. Welcome, sir. We also have Ambassador Stefan Gompertz. Apologies if I mispronounce your name. Former ambassador to Austria and Ethiopia. Welcome. Good morning to you, I believe. And also we have Mr. Atma Sutadase, who is the President and CEO of Trade and Development Bank. Good morning and welcome. So today's topic is, who does the 21st century belong to? As probably you may be aware of, the world is in a totally different place as we speak. The shift in geopolitical dynamics happened really fast. And as Russia is waging its war in Europe, there is a perception that perhaps its powers is declining. And as predicted, China is now the rising power, and the U.S. has perceived China as one of the most important, most significant threat geopolitically. And we also saw that the constellation have changed. The U.S. is no longer going for the traditional security and economic partners, but it has expanded beyond that. Countries such as South Korea, Japan, and New Zealand have been invited to the NATO conference for meeting recently. And the G7 countries is also trying to match China's economic diplomacy in continents and regions such as Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. So we are seeing this with great interest. And of course, if anybody asked Indonesia, for example, or any other country that it does not belong to any of this constellation, like who do you associate or align yourself to? That is a more complicated question. So with that, I will allow, or I will invite our esteemed panelists to speak for 10 minutes and share their thoughts on questions such as what do you think are the impacts of United States and China's rivalry to the global politics today? And what is the potential role of Global South in issues such as climate change, international security, and economic transformation? Is the world becoming bipolar or multipolar? And how should the Global South countries position themselves? And after that, we will open question and answers, including from our participants joining us from YouTube. So first, allow me to invite His Excellency Ambassador Gurjit Singh. So, Ambassador, what do you think of the state of the world today, and how do you think that impacts global politics?
Thank you, Professor Dayu, and I'm very happy to see again my old friends, Ambassador Stefan Gompas and Ato Masu Tadese, and all of you from FPCI. So, in honor of Indonesia, I wore my batik today. Though with the other panelists, I suddenly remember that we have Addis Ababa in common. On behalf of the Rising Asia Foundation, I thank FPCI for this joint effort today, and I hope it contributes to a better understanding. The three panelists are actually from three different continents, so I think that should make a difference and provide a new, at least different perspectives of understanding. I think the subject is a challenging one. We are trying to determine who owns the 21st century when we don't even know who owns next year. So I think it is possibly better to decide about to whom does the next 5 years belong or the next decade belong. A century now, frankly, is getting to be too large to decide now. As you mentioned, Professor, the world is truly dynamic. And over the last few days, I mean, you see what happened with the Chinese National People's Congress. You see what happened in the rapid changes in the UK. Some are predictable, some are unpredictable. So, how do you determine, therefore, who belongs it? Essentially, what I would like to say is the 21st century belongs to the people of the world. Somewhere along the line, we have forgotten them, but we can't. Democracy means the voice of the people. So we have to make sure that people's voices are heard. Now, the international order also needs to be democratized. The global south needs to be represented in the higher echelons of the United Nations, for instance, as it is in the G20. But we find that international organizations are not willing to reform, and neither are they performing. The United Nations, which was a beacon of hope, is today a disaster. The big powers were supposed to come together and manage the world to maintain security, stability, and development in a post-World War II situation. Today, the big powers not only can't come to a consensus and manage things, they've also started quarreling and fighting each other. And this is not good for the rest of the world. We need to democratize the international order so that more countries' voices are heard, and this quarrel between democracies and autocracies should not be limited to the domestic sphere, but the international order also needs to become more democratic. When I said the people are important, I think one of the targets which is in front of us is the Sustainable Development Goals. We all know that the Millennium Development Goals were missed by a long mile. But we can't let the SDGs fall foul because the global population is looking at these to sustain themselves for the future. Maintaining the SDGs or achieving them is a common global responsibility of people, civil society, and governments. But the way governments are fighting in Ukraine or threatening to fight over Taiwan, this is detrimental to the global goals that the world itself set for itself by accepting the SDGs by 2030. The pandemic has taught us the values that we need to pursue. Therefore, public health, economic recovery, these all need to be pursued but are today being ignored due to interstate politics, regional battles, and a growing bipolarization in the world. You asked Professor, are we a bipolar world? Are we a multipolar world? I think we are somewhere in a transition between polar worlds. We are not quite certain. I think economically we are still multipolar. Strategically, greater efforts toward bipolarization have been made. And these, as I said, are unreliable. The big powers have tried to veto everything in the United Nations Security Council, pushing important problems like Ethiopia, like Myanmar, to the regional bodies of the African Union and the ASEAN. So therefore, what this means is the Security Council is not performing, but the institutions of the Global South have an opportunity to perform. Therefore, how the AU led talks on the civil war in Ethiopia and how ASEAN will deal with Myanmar today becomes all the more important, because if the Global South has to play a bigger role, it also has to assume greater responsibility. Therefore, in conclusion, I must say that it is time for the Global South to step forward. This year, Indonesia is the G20 chair. The next chair is India, followed by Brazil in 2024 and possibly South Africa in 2025. India and Indonesia are both making a greater effort to give the Global South, particularly Africa, a greater say and focus at the G20. So this idea that for the next 4 years, 4 Global South countries are going to be leading the G20 gives us the responsibility of protecting the G20 from the predatory behavior of the big powers. This is not their forum anymore. We have to make it our forum and make sure that, yes, there are battles in the world, but these battles should not be allowed to dismantle the G20 and remove the global agenda, which remains very important. But can the Global South simply talk and get away with it? But I think the Global South needs to do something. Why are we dependent only on the G7 for financing or the BRI for that matter? Why don't we use the institutions of the Global South? Say India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa come together. There's so many regional institutions, and Nato Admasu is there. Why can't we pool our resources and create funds which can do something to achieve the SDGs? India is working on trilaterals like this, and the focus is on impact investment to reach the SDGs by investing in good ideas, by promoting local talent and making sure that we attain the goals we set out without being digressed due to the battles between the bigger powers. And maybe we should help them to solve their problems. I will stop here. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think it's also important for the Global South to recognize that it is indeed the time for them to step up. And perhaps with that, this is a good introduction to our next panelist, Mr. Admasu Tadesse. So do you share Ambassador Gurjit's, I should say, frustration of multilateral institutions? He emphasized that there is a need to reform. And if so, how do you think that reform should go? And what are the roles of organizations such as the organization that you represent, the Development Bank, to perhaps navigate these changes and also be a prominent player in navigating these changes? So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Pleasure to be here with all the fellow speakers. I think the title of this conversation is provocative, but I guess Ambassador Singh has really kicked off very well by saying we don't even know what to expect next year, let alone talk about the whole century ahead. But that having been said, I think the one thing that we're quite excited about in the African continent is that, we're getting a lot of traction on the development front. And of course, as you develop both economically, socially, and politically as well, it actually paves the way for the African continent to actually participate much more robustly in the global order, as it were. The global order, of course, is very complex, and Ambassador Singh really has spoken to the various issues that are percolating around. I think there are very serious conversations going on around reform. I think the global institutions have been considering reforms for a long time, but there's very little movement, if the truth be told. I represent an MDB, an African MDB. We do have partners both within Asia as well as in Europe. And so we have a very strong international relations, momentum that's been very positive and that's been building up. And so when we think of this 21st century, we think of a century of partnerships. We think of a century of growing trade. We see a new set of opportunities arising from all the new economic centers in the world that represent big opportunities for Africa, both from an investment sourcing perspective, a trading perspective, but also just in terms of strengthening the global South, if one could use the term. And so yeah, I think for us, we continue to push the voice, the African voice on the global landscape on various economic and financial issues, but certainly, in terms of representation in big institutions, like Ambassador Singh mentioned, in the case of United Nations, we all know there's been a big clamoring call for better representation. And that has been on the cards for some time. But again, I think the question is whether there's going to be meaningful opportunity for reform, or is it just going to continue to be business as usual? And I think there are commentators who are perhaps better placed than myself to sort of gauge whether there will be seriousness or not to actually reform. But for us, we see the demographics and the ongoing economic growth working in our favor to some extent in the African continent. I think it'll make us a very strong continent in terms of attractiveness for investment and partnership. And the truth is, it's not going to be binary. And I think we already have a very strong history of economic relations with Europe, but that's now picking up very strongly with Asia. And we think other parts of the world will perhaps come in as well a little bit more robustly than has been the case in the past. But we have a very strong spirit of Pan-Africanism in the sense that we want to see trade and cross-border investment. We want to see African problems being addressed through African solutions, because we know that the rest of the world will come to the party much better when they see Africans taking responsibility for their own issues. And in this regard, I think even though the global South is important in a number of ways, the continents, each of the different continents have their own institutions and bodies, and it's important that each region also makes a very strong effort to provide the lead on solutions, because if Africans don't take responsibility for their own problems, then really there will be a credibility problem globally on multiple fronts. But that doesn't mean that the continent doesn't need partnership. I think definitely there has been a lot of positive history over the past 70 or so years where developing countries have collaborated very strongly. We see it in our business, very strong growing trade and investment with countries like Brazil, India, of course, has been very long standing as an economic partner. China has come in. I see South Korea, Japan is beginning to come in. So yeah, I think it's an exciting time. I think sometimes the debates are nicely framed in a provocative way to evoke reaction and get some stimulating discussion. But the truth is, it doesn't have to be binary in any particular way. I think the multiple pathways and the multiple partnerships do present a win-win across the board. So I don't think it's a win-lose. And I mean, I hear a lot of statements around multipolarism and bipolarism. I think the reality it is multipolarism, because we're all sitting in different parts of the world, and we're not insignificant, even though we may not be so big economically or have as much influence, but we are relevant. So I think it's kind of a given that we are all significant players in a globalizing world. Even though that pace of globalization may be changing, we all have an important role to play. So I think it's fair to say we all have to stand up to be counted.
Thank you. So basically, globalization is happening, and although it is changing, everyone has a role to play, and perhaps multipolarism is already here, even without having to provoke that discussion. And with that, please allow me to invite Ambassador Stefan. What do you think of this growing rivalry between China and the U.S.? How does that, influence global discussions, such as I think Mr. Atmasu talked about the issues surrounding development, economic cooperation, but there are also issues such as climate change and also security as well. So how do you think the global events influence important global discussions? You're still on mute. I'm sorry. Yes, you're still
Right.
mute. Okay.
So, okay, good. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to take part in that discussion and to see good friends again. I'll try and address your questions, but before I do so, allow me just to make a few preliminary remarks. First, the title is very interesting, as other speakers said. To me, it sounds quite optimistic, because it means that the century will belong to someone. Hopefully, as Ambassador Guzik put it, it will belong to the people. But this is far from certain. And my fear is that actually, if we don't act together, the century might belong to no one. And we might be overwhelmed by events, be there a global warming, terrorism, and so on and so forth. So our main ambition should be to make sure that indeed the century belongs to someone, and specifically, as you said, Gurjit, to the people of the world. Second point, I don't think I will surprise you if I say that I have some difficulties with the concept of global South, because I do not belong to the so-called global South. I'm more struck by the diversity of the South. And there are a lot of differences. That this reminds me of the discussions I already had a long time ago when I was posted in Geneva, and I dealt with UNCTAD. I'm not sure there's so much unity among South countries, but these obviously could be discussed. Third point, actually, I think we should broaden the scope, and among the players also mention private companies. I mean, the president of Atmasu Tedeschi here is a testimony to that. Private companies play a very important, probably growing role in world politics. See the crisis in Ukraine, now the role that Elon Musk is playing by helping the Ukrainians to have a telecommunication system. And indeed, it creates some tensions. I'm thinking about the kind of crackdown which occurred in China recently against Alibaba. The central state in China wants to control private companies. Now, obviously, we could speak about it at length, but I think our discussion should take this role of private companies, either old ones or new ones, into account. When I speak about private companies, I'm also think about the entrepreneurship, and especially in Africa. I'd like to refer to what and Masud Adessa just said, the fact that there are more and more young entrepreneurs in the world, but especially in Africa, is by itself very encouraging, and this is a positive sign. Now, I'll try and address the question of unipolar versus multipolar. One thing is certain: the world dominance of the United States seems to belong to the past. It doesn't mean that the United States is not powerful. It is very powerful, or she is very powerful, but not alone. You know, I remember what Chinese dignitary once said in a private conversation that was a couple of years ago to a Western counterpart. It was obviously private. He said, you know, China dominated the world for 2,000 years. Then the West took over for another 2,000 years. But now this parenthesis is about to be closed. Now, whether it reflects the state of mind of Chinese leaders or not, I don't know. But listening to what Xi Jinping said recently, I might tend to believe it is more or less true. It doesn't mean that China will necessarily dominate the world, because at least for two reasons. First, because there are some resistances to China's influence, especially with the growing debt of some countries like Laos, like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and so on. In Pakistan, the debt of Pakistan is 84% of the GDP, which is quite huge. And recently, the Minister of Finance of Bangladesh advised countries to think twice before accepting new loans from China. So it is not evident that China will continue to expand the way it has done so far. And also the other reason, the reason Ambassador Guzik mentioned, namely that new powers are emerging and playing an ever-growing role on the international scene, which gives other countries a greater choice among partners. You know, I was very interested to read recently an interview with which the new leader of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, gave to a radio network. He said, "We are free to choose our partners. France is a partner, but we have other partners. Russia is a partner as well." Now, obviously, as Frenchmen, we might not be delighted to see Russia playing a growing role in Africa. But the very fact that those countries now have the choice between several partners is very healthy per se. Now, it's up to us to prove that we can deliver a real partnership. Therefore, I would be tempted to say that indeed we are gearing towards a new multipolar world. Now, the danger is that this multipolar world might be a chaotic one and not an organized one. First, because, as Ambassador Guzik said, the UN, well, needs to be reformed. Everybody agrees with that, but when it comes to the crux of the matter, there's no agreement. Now, we, as in France, we agree, and we have said that for a long time, we agree that the Security Council should be broadened. I mean, the Security Council now, as it is, reflects the reality of 1945, but not the present reality. So it should be indeed, it should be broadened. Now, obviously, the question becomes difficult when it comes to the choice. Which country should be allowed? Which country could become permanent members? So should we have new permanent members or semi-permanent members? It is very complicated because there are rivalries. There are rivalries on each continent. And that is also for Europe. As far as Europe is concerned, should we take Germany in, or should we take Italy or other countries or the European Union? But then should the European Union take over the right of veto, which now belongs to France? I mean, those are very tricky questions, and we are far from finding a solution. So perhaps the answer to the present UN crisis could be, as Ambassador Guzik put it out, a growing role of regional organizations. But again, regional organizations are facing difficulties. See the difficulty the EU is facing when it comes to adopting a common policy on energy, or even adopting a common policy towards Russia, towards the Ukraine crisis. We have difficulties with our friends from Hungary. The ASEAN has difficulties in finding a solution to the crisis in Myanmar, and so on and so forth. Perhaps and this is, I read, Gurjit, I read your recent article on the G20, which you sent us with great interest. Perhaps indeed the G20 could be able to play a growing role because it's less formal than the EU, there's no veto, and it does reflect the diversity of the world. I don't want to speak for too long, but I'd like to add that the world dominance will probably depend in the years to come on new factors. The emergence of new technology, cyber technology in warfare and in peaceful relations. The relevance and the importance of the soft power and the social media. Russia is playing that very intelligently in West Africa against us, against France, using the social media to criticize us and increase its influence. We see the growing role played by satellites and space. Space is becoming again a field of rivalry or cooperation, or both. The second element, which will probably help define who the 21st century belongs to, is governance. And when I say governance, I'm not saying necessarily democracy versus dictatorship, but whether the way the power is applied in a country helps resolve the needs of the country or the needs of the region. A last factor which will certainly play a role, and this I'm going back to what Admasu Tadesse rightly said, the power of demography. I mean, Africa now is going in the years to come to be the main demographic power in the world, and clearly the economy is going to follow suit. So I think we're heading towards perhaps a new form of globalization with more localized crisis, perhaps more restrictions on trade liberalization and on dependence, because due to the recent crisis, countries are feeling more and more the need to find on their own territory the necessary resources. This, for instance, what President Macron did recently when he encouraged the development of an electric car industry in France, which we don't have so far, or the production of lithium, which we don't have either, because we don't want to be too much dependent on other countries. But the real challenge, as other colleagues already said, will be whether, and this will determine whether the 21st century belongs to the people, whether we'll be able to face the collective challenges we are all confronted with: global warming, water shortages, pandemics, terrorism, and also, and I will conclude with that, new patterns of development. I mean, clearly, perhaps we will discuss the issue. Development cannot, and aid to development cannot continue as they have done so far. They have been quite successful in certain respects, but not entirely. And more emphasis will be put on the private sector, on investment, and particularly on impact investment. This is also something you stressed, Gurjit, in your recent article. And for me, it's quite interesting because I'm an advisor to an impact investment fund in Africa. And more entrepreneurs realize that development by itself is not sufficient, but the human dimension, social dimension, relations between men and women have to be taken into account. So these are quite promising avenues, which might perhaps contradict the rather pessimistic views I have expressed so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have questions from YouTube. So let me start with the most provocative one. This is very much related to our topic. So basically, one of our participants believe that the question of who does the 21st century belong to remains open. So to all panelists here, perhaps, do you think that there will be few powerful states that will be in control, or will there be resources sharing between the different states? I'll probably start with Ambassador Gurjit Singh. What do you think?
Thank you. So, to me, the question is, who will be responsible for the 21st century? So which countries will take the responsibility of making sure that we live in a better world? And to that, my current answer is the G20, and which is why I want the G20 to provide leadership, not get sidetracked by battles elsewhere, and focus on the agenda of common good. But yes, I think that economically and functionally, we are still in a multipolar world. And I think Indonesia, ASEAN, India, not only Africa as a whole, but I think the regions of Africa, East, South, Center not so much, but West and North, they are important poles. France is an important pole. Germany is, Japan is, Australia is becoming one. So I think we need to look beyond the current powers that run the United Nations to look at other powers. And one reason why, as an Indian, I don't want to condemn Russia outright is because for me, Russia is an important pole to keep a balance in this world. You vanquish that pole and you leave the field open to the Chinese and the Americans to sort all of us out. So we all need more poles rather than less. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go to Mr. Admaswi. You mentioned that this is a time where there are opportunities for partnerships, and how do you think that that avenue should be pursued in order to avoid a situation where we have the few powerful states keep dominating economic development, for example?
Thank you for the question. I just generally have a very strong position around scaling up, because I think when you look at the development agenda before the developing South, but Africa in particular, we need several partners, because there's just so much that needs to be done by way of investment, by way of technical partnerships, and of course trade. And so the truth is, when you get beyond the polemics, you start to realize that, you know, scaling up requires multiple partnerships, and it also requires you know, a sense of stability on the global landscape. If the global community is really not managing to cooperate very well, it has very serious implications to the global macroeconomy, and that's very bad for investment and financing. So for us, I think we are, of course, a very relevant part of the world going forward, but of course we don't have as much influence as the big powers. The truth is, the architecture of the UN and the Security Council reflects the fact that there are clearly multiple powers. I think that's why the Security Council has 5 permanent members. That just says a lot on its own, right? I think there will be continued movement, I think, to get that better inclusivity and diversity. Globally these days, those 2 terms are very popular, you know, inclusivity and diversity. And there's no way that that can be ignored going forward, whether it's at the political level or the economic level. We champion issues of inclusive finance as much as we do it for various population groups. I think the same values apply at a much higher level, at a global level. I think voice, participation, and also just sort of showing responsibility. When you're a big power, you have to show some thoughtfulness and restraint to ensure that, you know, the global system that you have a huge influence over is not going to be you know, disrupting others, right? So I think the big question of, you know, is it still an open matter going forward? I think it's an open matter, but in a sense, we know diversity and multiplicities of players are the way to go, and it's going to happen one way or the other. The question is, will it be messy or will it be orderly, and will the relevant powers be inclusive and embracing of a shared participation in our common destiny on climate, but also on security.
Thank you. Now, perhaps to Ambassador Stefan, you mentioned that there's also a threat that the 21st century belonged to no one. So do you think that it's still necessary for few powerful states to demonstrate global leadership and maintain their influence?
Yes, certainly. But when I say leadership, I don't mean dominance. It has to be done in a cooperative spirit. And you know, there are precedents. Look at the International Space Station, for instance. Even though now Russia has withdrawn from it, but we hope it will be temporary. Look at the ITER program aiming at creating new source of energy through fusion, and all big countries of the world are part to the project. So it is possible, especially as far as the big challenges which we are confronted with are concerned, especially global warming, because it's our common interest. If there are sandstorms in the Middle East, we cannot ignore it. If there are floods in Bangladesh, we cannot not ignore it. If agriculture in Europe is threatened, other parts of the world cannot ignore it either. So we have common interests.
Ambassador, you are frozen. It seems like we have issues with connection. Okay, let me move forward with the other questions first before we go back to Ambassador Stefan. So, Ambassador Gurjit Singh, do you think that the Global South countries should also be part of the Chinese and US competition, or should they, define their own route and take charge?
I would agree with what Ambassador Gompert said. The idea is now not to be competitive, but to be cooperative and show leadership in a cooperative sense. And also go back to what Ato Admasu said and what Ambassador Gompert said about the role of entrepreneurship and the private sector. Now, if you look at the UK, their new Prime Minister is actually a banker, investment banker. So, Ato Tadese, I'm looking at you with even greater expectations now. So, the thing is that we need to get the international leadership to start thinking more about developments rather than only strategic interests. This requires a management of the international system. Since the entire international system is not well managed by those who were given responsibility in the UN, I again come back to the G20 as perhaps the current solution to managing the world better. Now, in this, there has to be a collective leadership. But some of the G20 members are more interested in rusticating other members than in keeping them on board for larger strategic reasons. That is why I said it is for the next 4 chairs of the G20 who come from the Global South to show greater leadership. But as Ambassador Gompert pointed out, between us, there is not enough conversation and not enough coordination to do good things together. We do good things individually, but do India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil do things together in the Global South? So I'm happy to say that the institution of IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, is being revived, and there would be a summit on the sidelines of the G20 in Bali, a summit which has not been held for 7 years. So that means that still over 7 years, we were all satisfied with the way the world was running. But today we realize that no, we need to go back to ourselves. Now, in this, I looked at impact investment, I look at entrepreneurship development, and I look at cooperation between regional financial bodies like the Trade and Development Bank, with India, with Brazil, with Indonesia, among others. And we should take the leadership rather than only listen to the, bring back better or the BRI. Don't give them the leadership. Leadership should be ours. Let them now come behind us, and we should take. Other point is, we mentioned about the inability of the United Nations to reform itself or even decide who the new members of the Security Council should be in case reform takes place. But even BRICS cannot decide who to be its additional members, because today the IPSA don't want BRICS to become a Chinese organization. We don't want them to decide only who will decide who will be a member. And in this, unfortunately, Russia has reached a state that they simply follow the Chinese, and they are not playing an independent role of a multipolar power. So therefore, it is for the global south within the BRICS also to prevent China running away with BRICS and making sure that we have our say. For instance, Indonesia should be there. More Africans should be there. But can we decide that only on the basis of what China wants? No. So we must stand up against China, like we have in the non-aligned movement 50 years ago, stood up against the United States and the Cold War. We need to not go back to non-alignment. We need to have our strategic autonomy, focusing on the sustainable development goals and better development and economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very unfortunate that we lost you, Ambassador Stefan Gompertz. So we were at, you were explaining about the excellent examples of cooperation. Perhaps if you would like to continue from your remark.
No, I was just going to say that, and on this I agree with Ambassador Gurgitz as well, that whatever we think of present crisis and the behavior of certain countries, it is essential to continue to talk to each other. And this is what our president has been advocating in the case of Russia. We completely disagree with the Russia's aggression against Ukraine, but it's essential to maintain a channel of communication with the Russian leadership. It's not that it doesn't mean that we love each other and we might have conflicting interests, but it is necessary, it is our common interest to maintain a good channel of communication. This is what I wanted to stress.
Thank you. Now let me go to Mr. Atmasuta Dese. So there's also a question on the importance of having a conversation. I think Ambassador Stefan Gompertz also mentioned that the governments are not the only actors. There's the private sector. There's also, Ambassador Gurjit Singh mentioned, the people. So how should we begin this conversation, not only between the different actors, the government, the corporate sector, and also groups of representing the marginalized, and not only countries in the global south, but also global north? How should we begin this conversation?
I think the history of development that we've seen unfold over the past 70 years has been phenomenal. We've seen the miracles, multiple miracles in mostly Asia, the Far East, but now it's coming to India. We've had great examples here in Africa, Botswana, Mauritius, where I am right now. And we've had other stories of strong growth. And we think transformation, economic transformation, and just healthy evolution of our societies, whether it's climate or achievement of SDGs, that requires a great deal of investment. And when you talk about investment, there's public and private investment. We know that there's limits to growth, limits to opportunities with just public investment. So clearly the private sector has a very important role to play. And I think really a new sort of international framework going forward should be centered around, merit, substance, and who's actually providing value. Here in the African continent, we are always reaching out to different economic centers in the world to attract investment and partnership and cooperation. And we've been successful in some respects, But the sense is that there still hasn't really been enough partnership coming through. There's a lot of talk, but in reality, not a whole lot comes through. We've seen huge growth in the past couple of decades from the Asian space. The two big countries in Asia, of course, China and India, but we're seeing South Korea and Japan starting to come through more strongly. I think the reality is multiple partnerships, multiple sources of cooperation and investment is what everybody wants to see here in the African continent. And I don't think that is constrained necessarily by different types of economic powers or global powers that might be jostling for mutual control, if one could use that term. So for us, I think we're very open-minded at the African continent, and what we have become much more aware of over the years is the empty talk versus those who really act, right? So we're in a world where social media and information is very accessible. I think Ambassador Stefan talked about that space, where people have much more information, much more understanding. And I think, all the big powers out there should really understand that there is a public opinion that is not always reflected in social media, and that is really informed by the substance of conduct, the substance of behavior that people actually see. And it's not the case where there's just one or two major media houses now setting the narrative and sort of framing the issues. People have a very good sense of what's going on. And I think for those who are interested, in being relevant in Africa, working well with Africans for whatever reasons, whether it's just being very influential at the global level, or whether it's getting a nice dividend from the demographics and the future growth of Africa. I think all players should think about substance and conduct, right? And I think in the end, that will really open up opportunities. And when people start choosing partners, they will choose partners based on that assessment, that fair assessment of which partners are sincere, which partners really want to see African countries move forward. We need space, but we also need partnerships. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I believe, Ambassador Stefan, you mentioned about impact investment. So how can that collaboration between the public sector, the private sector, and civil society can generate the greatest impact globally?
Well, thank you. It's an interesting question. As I said, I'm an advisor to an impact investment fund in Africa, which has been operating now for 20 years. It's still a small fund, but there are other similar funds, and we are active in West Africa and also in Madagascar and some East African countries like Kenya. So the way we proceed the following: we try and find young companies, not necessarily startups, but young companies which look profitable, because obviously we don't want to lose our money, which look profitable, but which also have endeavored to favor the protection of the environment, or good governance, or good social relations, or all those three aspects linked together. And we invest in those companies through various channels for a limited period. Might be 5 years, might be 10 years, might be 15 years, but the aim is to help the company grow and then to withdraw, to let other players come in. Now, to answer your questions, obviously we can get the support either of public entities, for instance, the French Development Agency or the German Development Agency, or also private funds or foundations, which give additional money and give our intervention more weight and more credibility. So the cooperation is going on quite well, both with public entities and with private entities.
Thank you. I have a question for Ambassador Gurjit Singh. There is a question from a participant on the role of regional organizations, including the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. What role do you think they should play?
Thank you. Before that, may I just comment in support of
Yes,
what
of
Stefan said about impact investing? So I too am associated with funds which do impact investing. And I think they have close to $1 billion under several funds. Initially, they work primarily in India. And as Ambassador Gompert said, we only invest in early stage companies which are achieving some SDGs. If you don't achieve an SDG, you won't get funding. And from India, we move to Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia. We have investments in Indonesia supported by our funds. Our next target is Africa, where we have been holding a summit in Nairobi for almost 7 years now, and we are moving into Ghana and Ethiopia hopefully soon. And there we are trying to support a local talent and ideas in achieving this. And with the help of AFD from France, KFW from Germany, and the former DFID from the UK and others, we are having both private and government-to-government funds entirely looking at impact investment. Therefore, I believe that this is really a way to go. Secondly, now answering your question about regional organizations. So I think having been ambassador to both the African Union and ASEAN, I have had a fairly good fill of regional organizations in the global south and how they are constrained but yet ambitious. Now, I think where development is concerned, these organizations play a good role. Even in the case of ASEAN, if you see the ASEAN economic community and the socio-cultural community, I think those are less troublesome and actually show more achievement. But when you come to the political security community, that is where you have larger problems. A, because the role of outside powers, the regional organizations are unable to deal with. And in the case of problems within member states of these organizations, as I had earlier said, the UN gives the space to the regional body. But if the regional body has to make sure that it acts with responsibility and finds a solution, otherwise there are enough partner countries waiting to be extremely critical of the way the regional body functions. So the regional bodies are extremely challenged. One, because they don't have enough experience in dealing with such issues. And sometimes I find the member states have become more obdurate. And I think you know what I mean in ASEAN. I mean, they don't listen to you. So how do you have the impact of peers onto your members? Now in Africa, there is an Africa peer review mechanism. You know, over some years, it has stopped reviewing people because countries, it was voluntary. Countries don't come out. So I think this movement within the regional bodies to stand up and show what is right without being pushed by the big power is extremely important. And only if they can act in that manner can they take leadership for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go to Mr. Atmasu. Perhaps you can also share your experience in Africa. How does African institutions and bodies can also offer, as you said, the African solutions, and what potential role can they play as well?
You know, institutions are by very nature dynamic, and of course they grow over time. So it's not something that one can look at in a one frame of time and make a fair assessment. I think, you know, the trajectory and the momentum of time helps these institutions become more effective, and that comes on the back of course development and education and experience and all of those aspects. And you know, Africa has a 50 or so year history of having been independent, so to speak. after many decades and centuries of being badly treated. And so trying to recover from all of that and building up institutions that are genuine and sort of reflective of the reality of Africa's own character, that takes time. But also space is required in that regard. I think this is why sometimes we say as adults who have children, you have to let your children kind of grow through their own experiences and sometimes let them make some of their own mistakes as part of the process of growth. My institution, the Trade and Development Bank, has been around for about 38 years. And you know, the first 20 years were very weak. We struggled to find our feet, so to speak, and there were a lot of challenges. But as time passed, we learned through our mistakes, and the human capital improved, and the cooperation with the rest of the world improved, and that really provided strong acceleration in terms of our growth and development. And of course, today we're very well regarded, and we're quite functional and very impactful, if the truth be told. And you know, we've managed to attract very strong partners, specifically from the two continents that are very close to Africa. I think the Europeans historically have always been strong, but over the past 20 years, I think several Asian countries have come through and supported not just the economic process, but institutional development as well. I think Ambassador Stefan made references to a number of European partners, KfW Group, Agence France de Développement, the DFID, which is today FCDO, the Norwegians, Denmark has been an amazing partner to us just in recent years. And none of this existed about 5-10 years back. This happened all within the past decade. And so it just shows that when Africa is also given some room and space to develop, we start building up institutions that can become very interesting counterparts to institutions in the rest of the world. And it's true that you know, the rest of the world will only have appetite for Africa when they see us as being, you know, organized to some extent, stable, and with counterparts that can work with the rest of the world. But if one is not given space, and if there's no support being given to this institutional development, then you know, there'll always be these difficult challenges of not knowing how best to work with Africa, how to invest in Africa, who to work with in Africa. And so in this regard, I think there's lessons to the different parts of the world, you know, in terms of how to invest in the future. The reality is those partners that really make very credible and genuine investments in the development of a continent will be the ones to reap the opportunities of the future as they emerge, because there'll always be choices being made, and those choices will be shaped by the experiences that these countries and people have. I think there's criticisms on the types of cooperation that have been found to have gaps in our own history, in our recent development history, 20, 30, 40 years. You know, and I think that should be acute to different partners to find better ways of doing business on the development front as well as other areas.
Thank you. I believe Ambassador Dino Patijala has just joined us. Ambassador Dino, would you like to say a few words before we continue?
Dayu, please continue the program. I may say something in the end later, but please continue the discussion. Thank you.
Okay. So let me go to Ambassador Stefan then. Do you think that this regional cooperation is becoming a trend of the future, or should this be the trend of the future?
It certainly should, because there are things that can be dealt with at a local level, not on the global one. That's one reason. The other reason is that it's necessary for regional entities and countries which are member of them to take things into their own hands. And Africa is a very good case in point. When I was in Addis Ababa, along with Ambassador Gurjit, I was struck by the usefulness and the efficiency of what regional entities, the so-called RECs, the regional commissions like ECOWAS, for instance, or IGAD would do, and also the African Union. There have been failures, obviously, but they also have been very successful experiments, including in the area of peace building. So yes, I definitely agree that there is a lot to do for regional organizations. They do not contradict the role of the UN. You know, when I remember when I was in Addis, it was during the one of the crises which occurred in Côte d'Ivoire back when that. Well, anyway, I'm very bad with dates. This was the moment when, you know, Laurent Gbagbo clung to power and wouldn't relinquish his seat. So it was a difficult situation. And I remember a phone call I had from an UN colleague in New York and said, Stefan, can you keep us informed on an hourly basis on what's going on at the AU? Because this is the basis on which we're going to elaborate our proposals in the UN. So clearly there is a strong connection between what's going on in regional organizations and what's going on at the global level. And it is quite healthy if regional organizations take the initiative, take the lead, and make suggestions to the global community on how to handle a problem. Now, I'm not saying it should always be the case, but I've seen examples of a very good cooperation between those entities. Now, this being said, doesn't mean that those organizations are always successful. They are also, unfortunately, they are failures because this is the way the world functions. But yes, my answer to your question would be a definite yes.
Thank you. Before we invite everyone for concluding remarks, I have a question for Ambassador Gurjit Singh. There's a question from YouTube asking about the role of civil society. Should they play also an important role in safeguarding democracy? You mentioned about democratizing international order, but should they also be an important force to make sure that democracy stays within individual countries or states?
Indeed, I think if we are to pursue the goal of the SDGs, the role of civil society is extremely important. This will be important for regional organizations and it is important for the world. Just as entrepreneurship and private sector are important, civil society is equally a pillar for the future development of the world. However, civil society in many countries is coming under serious pressure. This larger debate of democratization and autocracies essentially means the first people who are shut down is the civil society. So that becomes extremely dangerous. So we must learn to live with them and listen to them because that is the voice of the people. But in some countries, people believe civil society is led by the financing of certain powers and therefore speaks in a certain way, which governments are sometimes uncomfortable with. So I think just as there's a democratization of the world and of the people, there also has to be a greater democratization of civil society and a sense of responsibility. You cannot become spokesman for an agenda and otherwise you will be discredited. So credible civil society is extremely important for the future of the 21st century.
Thank you. I would like to invite Ambassador Dino to say a few words.
Okay, thank you, Dayu. And I want to say hello to all the speakers and all the participants. I apologize for coming in late. I had an emergency meeting in the beginning. But you know, I remember when I was a speechwriter to President Yudhoyono, I was writing one of his speeches about this topic of the Asian century. And we realized, look, I know there's the notion that the 21st century will be called the Asian century. But then when we thought about it more, we thought that's not necessarily so, you know. I think the 21st century will be everybody's century. You know, it will be the Asian century for sure, but it will also be the Latin century, it will be the African century. America will still be strong, and also Europe will remain robust in the 21st century. I think what is important is the perspective that when we say is the Asian century, or when Africans say is the African century, it means that the 21st century will be their best century relative to the previous ones. Meaning that for Indonesia, will probably be, the fourth largest economy by 2050, according to projections. But what really matters is that Indonesia, relative to the 19th century, 18th century, 17th century, or even the 20th century, will be in our best state economically, in terms of social development, and hopefully also politically, right? So I think the 21st century is special because regions and countries in most parts of the world will achieve their best development relative to where they were compared to a century or 2 centuries ago. And I think the biggest game changer, in my view, is first, if you talk about the 20th century, the game changer was independence, obviously, right? Around 150 countries or so gain independence in process of decolonization, and they changed the map of the world and also changed the dynamics of those nations, right? Now, we're already independent now. In the 21st century, I think the game changer that I see everywhere is first entrepreneurship, because it really energized the economic and social pulse of society. It enlarged the middle class everywhere, right? Second force, I would say, is technology. Technology is definitely the biggest driver of change in the 21st century. You can name any technology. It can be in food, in health, in telecommunications, what have you, but definitely is changing changing world affairs. They say technological change in the next 10 years will be much more faster and impactful than technological achievement in the last 100 years. So technology will be the second driver, and a third is I think connectivity. How we all have been much more connected now than before, and that will really revolutionize the way nations and peoples interact and the way developments are happening. So with those three things, I think every nation and every region in the world will achieve their best century in the 21st century. The only way we bungle it if we let nationalism out of control. If we get stuck in protectionist impulses, right? If we get populism wrong, if we get governance wrong, and if countries are still stuck in the cycle of corruption, for example, right? So those will slow down us reaching 21st century as our best century. So I'll stop there, and I want to say thank you for this very fascinating discussions, and I wish all of us the best in this, what I know will be the best century for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Pai Dino, for that optimism. And now I will invite the panelists to perhaps provide your 2 minutes closing statement. I will begin with Ambassador Gurjit Singh.
Thank you. So, yes, I agree with Pai Dino on what he has said are the drivers. But I think the human intention and statecraft also need to be controlled. Simply because you have great technology doesn't mean that you don't suffer greater natural calamity or you don't have very devastating wars. So therefore, this is very important. That is where we need good leadership. Leadership in this world has dispersed. So therefore, we need to have a more cohesive approach. So therefore, I still believe that the G20 with a greater African interface is our best opportunity. In that, achieving the SDGs through impact investment, role of civil society, using the private sector, using regional bodies and economic institutions is the way forward. We cannot over-centralize this, but we also need to protect people from strong pressures being brought on all of us to decide to act in a particular way to support different objectives. Now, if you look on Russia, ASEAN is not united. They vote differently in the United Nations. Africa is not united. India is in a minority of consistently staying there. And yet we are supposed to work together. So let's work together at the G20. Let us not let it get derailed and try and protect it for the betterment of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me now invite Mr. Atmasu Tadesse.
Yes, thank you. Look, I think my final comments is an analogy we use here in the continent. In the jungle, you always have big animals. They are often referred to as the big five. And we often say that when the big five start fighting amongst each other, yeah, they can damage one another, but the actual smaller animals get hurt much more. And so they say when the elephants fight, the grass suffers. And this is where we really hope that the 21st century will be a century of enlightenment and conscientious engagement between the different powers, because the truth is, you know, we rely on them to keep the global order somewhat stable and constructive for development and continued evolution. The principle of no harm for me always comes out very strong. The reason I believe very much in regional approaches is because you do much less harm at the regional level than at the global level. And I have a member state that has been stalled, who was supposed to come in, Libya, and Libya hardly exists as a country today. And they were supposed to be one of my biggest member states and biggest investors, and they were destroyed, you know, in a very badly conceived operation. And that is an example of do no harm. You know, we may all have opinions and we may not like the style of leadership in certain countries. We may have misgivings about what goes on in countries, but, you know, do no harm. Don't make it any worse. And today we have a huge terrorist problem in West Africa, Boko Haram, which is terrorizing millions of women and young people and destroying livelihoods. And that can all be traced to one very misguided intervention. So this is why I think the global community should really be restrained and not intervene without, you know, proper engagement with regional institutions. This is a very strong view in Africa. And so that's the principle of no harm. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And with that, let me invite Ambassador Stefan Gumpertz.
Thank you. I'd like to echo what was said on the role and the importance of civil society organizations. I totally agree. We spoke about private companies, but CSOs also have a very decisive role to play to make this world a better one. To sum it up, I'd like to express the hope that this century will belong to the young generations. First, as was pointed out, through the use of new technologies which radically transform the world, and I hope they will continue to transform the world for the better. That they will not facilitate the dissemination of fake news, but they would facilitate the diffusion of reliable information and communication. Second, I hope that those young generations will be able to express themselves, they will have a say, and they will not be suppressed by dictatorship. I don't want to mention any country, but you certainly know which countries I'm referring to. And finally, I hope that thanks to our collective action of the young people, also of the elder ones like me, the younger generation will inherit a world which is still pleasant to inhabit. and will not become unbearable. But this again, this rests largely on all our hands. So let's try and act together. Let us try and act together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Stefan. With that, allow me to thank our panelists today, Ambassador Gurjit Singh, Ambassador Stefan Gompertz, and also Mr. Atmasu Tadesse. We have heard that if we would like a response to who does the 21st century belong to, we have the century should belong to the people, it should belong to the young, the century should represent more conscientious engagement and cooperation, that multilateral institutions and engagement have to be inclusive, it has to be reformed, and all of those need to take place to ensure that we have a planet that is sustainable for the young to live in. And with that, please allow me to invite Ambassador Dino for his closing remarks. Ambassador Dino.
Thank you very much. I really don't have a closing remark other than just to thank Gurjit, my good friend, Pak Stefan Gompertz, and Pak Atmasu Tadesse. I've learned a lot from your comments. This session is part of the Global Town Hall series that will be held on the 5th of November. We have about 3,000 participants registered from about 75 countries and about 80 civil society organizations, universities, and think tanks. Yeah. So I hope you will join that discussion on the 5th of November. And the reason why we're holding that global town hall is because we noticed that at a time when the world needs more dialogue, we see the space for dialogue shrinking at the moment. Yeah, we are seeing, you may disagree with me, but we're seeing more intolerance of other people's viewpoints. Yeah, and this is why we want to promote a grassroots East-West, North-South dialogue. It will be 15-hour long, so we can cover all time zones. And please feel free to join the Global Town Hall. I look forward to seeing you there and more beyond that. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Dayu. You've done an excellent job moderating here.
Thank you so much. With that, thank you to our highly esteemed panelists. Thank you, Pak Dino. Thank you for everyone joining us to YouTube. And let me return the screen and the microphone to Afni.
Thank you, Ms. Dayu, and all distinguished speakers for the insightful discussion. Also, thank you to all participants who have been tuning in on our YouTube channel. We hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as we did. Before we close, I would like again to announce that this year's Global Town Hall will be taking place next Saturday, 5 November 2022 from 9 a.m. until finish, involving North, South, East, West grassroots communities. You can register now at gth2022.com. On behalf of FPCI and Rising Asia Foundation, we thank you and see you at Global Town Hall 2022.
Thank you. Thank you, Ato Atmasu. Thank you so much for your time and your contribution. Great seeing you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Really good seeing you from Paris.
Thank you, Gurjit. Thank you,
Here is Pak Dino, my friend from Indonesia.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Ambassador Gompertz.
Sorry, I was called by the president, so President SBY, so that's why I missed the beginning. So otherwise, I would definitely.
You have got a good panel today. I'm very happy that we did this today. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all. And thank you all. Professor Dayu. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Let's be in touch.
Please do. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bukan. Apa? Google.